I think what we have had is two very valuable insights into the problems and the challenges which we are facing. Now, without wishing to restrict your academic freedom in any way whatsoever, what I would like just to remind you of is what the output from this morning's session is feeding into. And that is the ministerial conference next year, and indeed decisions about the future of the Bologna group. So when you are putting questions, what would be particularly helpful is if your questions were designed to illuminate that sort of issue and perhaps lead us on in that way. But as I said at the start, that is not to restrict you. The floor is now open to you. There is a roving microphone, I see. So if you would like to put a question, could you please raise your hand, and could you please start by giving your name and your institution? Who would like to be first?
My name is Ernő Keszei. I'm from Hungary, partly from the National Bologna Board, partly I'm still an active professor at the University. The presentations were really inspiring and very interesting, but what I missed as a scientist was a more sophisticated context. So the problem of academic freedom and institutional independence is much more complex. It is embedded, institutions are embedded in a society which has a very complicated way of functioning. So any surveys concerning the second presentation, or any political considerations concerning the first presentation, should be placed into this really complicated and sophisticated network. Without this, we cannot really have other results but scientific results. In sciences, we simplify as much as needed to have a clear picture, but this is a societal problem. So I would like to call the attention of the audience and of the BFUG, for example, whose member I am personally from the Hungarian part, that any considerations should take into account this sophisticated and fine social network. Thank you.
Good morning, Dorota Dakowska, University of Lyon, now France. Thank you to both of you, Livio and Janika, to bringing our attention to this blind spot, I think what seems to be a blind spot concerning the lack of attention to academic freedom in all these different fine tools of measurement of quality, let's say university quality. And I would like to go a bit further and ask you whether there is maybe even a contradiction, an intrinsic contradiction between the different indicators of measuring of academic autonomy, for example, which value, for example, the freedom to fire academic staff, which may be dangerous, as we can see in the Hungarian situation and also the Polish one. And also these indicators value what is called the diversification of sources of revenue, which means high tuition fees. For example, Great Britain has wonderful autonomy scores, of course, and it values also potentially this corporate financing that was mentioned by Janica. So my question is whether there is potentially even a contradiction between what is valued in these, let's say, autonomy indicators and the lack of attention in all these 4 dimensions of autonomy indicators to academic freedom. Thank you.
Would you like to comment on that?
Sure. Thank you very much. I totally agree. There is and might be contradictions. Actually, the case that I mentioned about the pharmaceutical company financing grad programs in Cologne, there was a court case brought by an NGO asking that the contract between the university and the company would be disclosed, which it wasn't at the time. And the court, in the second instance, also decided that the university cannot be forced to disclose the contract, even if there are concerns that there might be infringements on academic freedom on the grounds of the university's autonomy in these matters. So definitely there are contradictions between these different elements, which is another reason why we think it is, in terms of measurement, really important to take these different dimensions apart and look at them separately, and also to possibly see then contradictions that may arise between these different elements. And I think that's a very valid point. And in terms of what the gentleman from Hungary said earlier, I absolutely agree that these universities and higher education is always embedded in a societal context that needs to be taken into consideration. Again, in terms of measurement, this is a perspective that I'm looking at. I think that's where the qualitative case studies are extremely important because they can provide that context, both in terms of where's the society right now, what are the goals, what are the demands, but also historical context. How did this university sector come about? How was it influenced? Under what kind of principles does it operate? But I also think that there is a merit of doing quantitative measurements because it allows really to compare countries on a very large scale. And as I said, I absolutely agree that there's a lot of information missing that is very important. But at the same time, I think there are certain elements to academic freedom that are universal and that we can regard as such and measure as such, with always in mind that, of course, once we have a score, we also need to look behind the score and see what the situation on the ground looks like.
Yes, I would also like to comment briefly to the points raised by my very good friend Erne from Hungary, and obviously we will all agree we need more data, we need more research and more sophistication about the context. And in a way, although we did not coordinate in any way, we have both made an appeal to more research, more data, to more conceptual elaboration. But I should say, however, and I'm sorry to come in mind always with concrete examples and concrete situations. As we speak, a trial is taking place 200 kilometers from Istanbul, where some people are awaiting today life sentences in jail. How do I explain them any sophisticated questions or considerations about context when they are already in jail, and at the end of the day today they will be officially sentenced for life sentences? I think we should keep that in mind as well. Now, to this point also about the context, I think it is, and I raised this point myself, do we need whatever a definition, a measurement that is specific to the European higher education area? And my answer would be yes, very much so, because this is a different context, and the European higher education area is a sui generis construction, situation, animal. We cannot simply use models, definitions, measurements, which already exist, the UNESCO, Council of Europe, Convention, American Association of University Professors, because they are not adapted to this new sui generis reality, which is the European higher education area. And while saying this, I do acknowledge the value of the context, and this is a very complicated context, I realize. But I think, however, that thinking is needed, action is needed, and perhaps I should also say, well, I don't think I should say that, but great deeds are rarely based on research and evidence. They are based on vision. And it might be true for the case of academic freedom as well. About the other comment, I cannot agree more. I have written a paper exactly about this, which I highly recommend. We have witnessed amazing developments in university autonomy in Europe, both conceptually and practically. And the work of the European University Association is a good illustration of this. But it's not only that. The European Commission has insisted in the European Union through the Bologna process that universities as institutions be freed from captivity in the hands of the states for 2 decades now. And a lot of that has happened. There is more university autonomy in many countries of Europe than it was 20 years ago. But you are right, academic freedom has been ignored, again, both conceptually and in terms of policies. And you are also right, sometimes positive developments in university autonomy come at the expense of academic freedom. Now, the university is given the right to decide, and this is a real case. The rector says, in my university, there will be no gender studies. This is not a matter of university autonomy. That rector had the right to decide either way, but it is a matter of academic freedom. And one can mention so many other examples, including cases of firing, as you said. And there are such cases, again, not only in the East, but also in the West, where perhaps one would not expect it. Now, there are many questions related to what I claim to be the crisis of academic freedom in Europe, and one of them is the relationship between academic freedom and university autonomy. You know, if I ever had a sabbatical, which I might have in 10 years when the dust settles on our move to Vienna, this is one issue I would like to concentrate on.
Thank you for your presentations. My name is Volker Balli. I'm from the EU Strategic Partnership Creates. My question is to Livio about maybe second tension. Yesterday, one of the keynote speakers during the celebration said, to her it comes all down to the 3 words, students, society, values. You've been emphasizing the term university autonomy. Now, 2 issues have been emphasized. One is, over the last 10 years, that universities should be more aligned to societal needs, maybe not in the service of society, but at least be open to societal challenges and not lock themselves up in the ivory tower. And the second is the term values, because very apparently values are societal constructs. I mean, there are some universal ones, but otherwise they might be in a European and national context. And how could university autonomy relate to some governments, be it on the European level, be it on national level, is certain that their values, or the values they try to represent in the name of their constituencies, might be in tension with what some universities are claiming?
I was not here yesterday, but I think there is no contradiction between what I was trying to say and what I understand was mentioned in that talk. Because when we talk about students and society from a university perspective, what we are talking about is knowledge. And what universities do, production of knowledge for the society, transmission of knowledge through education to empower students, both as professionals and as citizens. I think what is at the center of this is about knowledge. And here is where academic freedom comes into the picture, because universities cannot fulfill their function, their role vis-à-vis society, which is production, transmission, dissemination, use of knowledge, unless they have academic freedom. And one of well, I'm not sure if it is the best definitions to add to your list if you didn't know it already, but one of the most beautiful definitions of academic freedom was proposed by Professor Lowe, professor from Yale, and he says, academic freedom is the price society has to pay for the public good, which is knowledge.
I'm Albert Schramm. I'm an economic historian, so I applaud the initiative to produce a global data set. Currently I'm at the University of Maryland, University College Europe. I've worked 18 years outside Europe, the last 6 years as Vice Chancellor in Papua New Guinea. My reflection is on the methods, the different approaches. The legal analysis, in my view, cannot really inform us a lot, because in many developing countries, the government on purpose creates a muddled context where, for example, the Higher Education Act is in clear contradiction with University Acts. So that's something to be mindful of. Regarding the incidence approach, I believe you're being a little bit dismissive about that, because when academics are fired for whatever reason, it's not only for expressing an opinion, it's also for going after corrupt politicians, for example, or when students are shot at, those are quite clear indications that something is wrong. Now, as to policy implications, I think we know very little about university systems outside Europe. And I think this data set will definitely highlight some of the risks in interacting with them and possibly bring some policy recommendations, because we really need to understand what's going on in those countries before we happily engage with African, Asian, or Latin American universities. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for this comment. I agree with what you said. As I mentioned, I also think that legal analysis is very problematic in countries where, both when there is contradiction between whatever is in, for example, the constitution and what is happening on the ground, but also where, legal analysis just doesn't bring us very close to understanding what is actually going on, more generally speaking. In terms of the incident approach, I also agree. Definitely, it can tell us the things that are going on. The fact that the data is selective and doesn't cover everything that is going on doesn't mean that the incidents that are recorded are not actually happening. So I think it is extremely useful data, actually. I've been working for years now with human rights case data, and we can learn a lot of very interesting things from it, but it remains problematic in the sense that we tend to look at this data and think that this is representative of what is going on in that country or across the world, and this is simply not something that this data is good for, because there will always be blind spots. We always have certain countries that we literally know nothing about because it just doesn't reach the international media. At the same time, we also know that only very severe repressive acts will make it into media reporting. So we will know about dismissals, we will know about imprisonments and killings and so on, but we will not know about suspension of classes or more institutionalized ways of restricting academic freedom. So this is the downside of this kind of data, which is why I think it is not useful to really give us this comprehensive idea of what is going on around the world, but it is always a very useful addition. And as I also said earlier, it is very useful to highlight countries or situations where academia is very much under attack. It is not so useful on the other end of the spectrum where you have not so severe restrictions. And in terms of policy implications, I think that is a very important point that is also relevant in the European context, even if we are looking at what is academic freedom in our countries. We have to think about these foreign policy implications or these partnership implications that also concern European universities, which are seeking to establish or have already long established partnerships with universities across the world, and which tend to be not so mindful of this question of academic freedom, that I think is a very important one, and where we also have a responsibility towards academia in these other countries to highlight these issues, to take them up in cooperation agreements, and to try and create more space for academic freedom in other countries.
We have time for one or possibly two more questions. Lady near the middle aisle, front of the back block.
Thank you, and thank you very much for your lectures. I'm Véronique Simon, and I work at the University of Uppsala in Sweden. And one of the a big issue in our country is the language issue, and I think it's it's really related to what you've been talking about, and especially the circulation of knowledge. Basically, in my country, or the country I live in right now, all knowledge is circulating in Swedish or English. And publications, well, it's the same. What our students do have access to is basically what is published in English or translated into English. And I think this is a big issue. I know that there were expectations that all citizens in the European Union would learn at least 2 languages upon their mother tongue, which is definitely not the case. And I think that there we have a very important limitation of academic freedom, because what we communicate in English, or, well, maybe not everyone has the means to do it, is not everything. Well, I think this is a big issue, and also related to what David talked about concerning next year, maybe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ella Ritchie from Newcastle University, UK, and I'm also on one of the BFUG groups. I had several observations for the 2 fantastic talks. Thank you. They did exactly what we hoped from presentations. They helped me, and I'm sure others, order our thoughts and experience on this issue, and made me realise that I knew more than I thought I did about the subject. The observation is that I think, sadly, in many ways, the UK is currently quite a good example of that complex relationship between society, students, and the role of academia. And you mentioned the letter, and there's been, over the years, many such cases of an MP asking about bias in the teaching of European Union studies. But there's a wider issue now where some voices from the Brexit Party and government are saying universities, which are, 95% remain, do not represent society. I had a separate question, though. I do quite a lot of work on university governance in Europe and in China, and no one mentioned, actually, whether the intervening variable of the structure and process and, representation in university governance was significant in terms of these issues. Thank you.
Would you like to comment?
Well, thank you very much. That is something to think about. The UK is a very interesting case, as always, and I will take the risk to call the UK a European country, and I hope it will remain in the European higher education area. I have nothing to say about the other European entity. And when it comes to university autonomy, academic freedom, also very interesting terrain for research, in particular given the history and the traditions. It was very interesting. Last week I listened to a presentation, very well-known, highly respected scholar from the UK who has his own definition and measurement tool for academic freedom. And he contrasted the autonomy scorecard, where UK is usually the first or among the first, with his own measurement, which he has done in many countries. The UK was on the very last place, really. And Greece is usually among the last in the autonomy scorecard. It was the first, the best in his own measurement. I mean, what this tells us is that either one of these tools are not exactly reliable. I have some suspicion which one is more reliable than the other, or perhaps that we really don't have both the conceptual clarity that is needed and the methodological tools to measure and compare. That's very interesting, because beyond measurement, the discussion becomes again about what is academic freedom, what is university autonomy, the relation with the society that you mentioned. And you are right. There are other recent developments or potential developments. Nigel Farage, I understand, declared publicly that if he ever gets to form the government, he will ban European studies altogether, and perhaps he has other, subjects on his agenda that he wants to ban. Now, to your other point about governance, for me, academic freedom and university autonomy are matters of governance. So sure we can talk about them as principle and as values, but in the practice of higher education, I see them as facets of university governance, and that's how I personally think about it. And of course, we can think about institution-level governance, system-level governance. I learned recently that sector-level governance could still be different, but for me, they are governance. Now, you also mentioned some, other parts of the world, and it's the research that has been done, both recent research, contemporary research, and historic research about academic freedom is very useful. So I use the phrase political epistemology that underpins attitudes, at least, to academic freedom. I learned it from studies comparing China with the United States and Europe, for example, where the researchers say, well, there's the Confucian tradition in China. It's not that there is no tradition. And that results in not only attitudes and values, but also specific arrangements, regulations. We, in Europe, had a rationalist, probably Enlightenment-based tradition. There is the pragmatist tradition in the United States. So it is very important and useful to consider not only what happens in other parts of the world, but the research that has been done about our other parts of the world. I would be very interested to see all the preliminary, at least, results of this project. And I have known about it for a while, and I have friends working on it. I think it's very intriguing, and if a global measure or measurement of academic freedom would be possible, that would be amazing. I am a little, I don't know how to say, not optimistic, but it's easy because it's not my work, so someone else has to do it. And I'm also a little concerned. There is a risk in our exercises at measurement, and don't take me wrong, I'm not against measurement, but there is always a risk that we move from measuring what we treasure to treasuring what we measure. And I think that we should be careful about it, which is not to say that this is not an exciting project.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And before I formally thank our speakers, just one or two observations. Firstly, at the back of the room, you will see what looks like a massive mind map of what has been going on in this room for the last hour and a half. Please do look at it, enjoy it. I'm not sure what the rules are, whether you're allowed to add to it or not. But if you are not, please share your thoughts with Helmi, who is producing our report. Just one or two observations from me. I think we have rightly focused on Europe. But from the perspective of the observatory, we see interesting things going on in other countries. For instance, in some of the former Soviet Union countries, moving towards greater autonomy for universities, greater academic freedom, the struggles they are having, but the progress that they are making. And I think it could well be wise to actually look at what is happening there, why it is happening, where it's happening more successfully than in other places. Secondly, sometimes the difficulty is not in the society, the difficulty is in the university. And a number of the situations which get referred to the observatory for us to investigate, what we actually find is that it's issues within the university that are serving to restrict the freedom, rather than issues in the society. But I guess all that serves to do is to underline the complexity of what we're dealing with. One of the things which the observatory did about 18 months ago as a contribution towards all of this was to launch the Living Values Project. What this does, it challenges universities to look at their values and to look at how closely they are living by those values. Now, if you go to the observatory's site, there's a button on the left-hand side which says Living Values, which takes you to the resources. And that set of resources is a live resource. We have just launched another 11 pilot sites, and we will add more to it. And our colleagues in Russia, in the latest chapter of this, have translated for us all of those materials into Russian. So now all of the countries which use Russian as a language will have much easier access to it. And that, I think, may make a contribution to the recognition of the importance of academic freedom within institutions. In concluding, what I would like to do is to congratulate the organisers of this conference for pairing our two speakers together. I think the insights which they have both offered have been so complementary, yet coming from different positions, that it's been enormously helpful in actually enabling us to understand a little bit more of this very complicated topic. I'd like to thank you for the very insightful and helpful questions. And finally, I'd like to thank our two speakers for an absolutely brilliant preparation and for sharing of their innermost research with us. So let's thank everybody. Thank you.